the run-up to this meeting today, the organizers put out some literature on the event, and it included some goals for it. It was hoped that today's event would be one that would explore practical considerations, opportunities, motivations, and constraints associated with climate change adaptation planning for infrastructure developers, managers, and practitioners. Also, there was a desire to try and frame this content in terms of best practices, legal and regulatory structures involved, and potentially useful information sources for the decision makers in the room here today. Last week also, Mr. Richard Lipsey, founder of ACT, had an article in the Globe and Mail where obviously more than what's presented here, but essentially it was entitled What Needs to Be Done with respect to adaptation. There were three items that came out of that. One was estimates of physical and biological consequences. The second was estimates of economic and social consequences. And three, assess available policies for coping with them. With the sort of final conclusion, we need to know much more. And while we may need to know much more, we may not need to know as much as we think we need to know. And we'll talk a little about that in this presentation. So this particular presentation is structured so that it starts off talking about decision making and decision makers, some practical considerations, some practical opportunities, some motivations for those involved, constraints, legal and regulatory structures, and ends with a series of some information sources that may be useful for people in the room after this event. The expectation is that we wouldn't necessarily go through all of the ones in Part 7 in detail, but that all of you would have access to this particular PowerPoint presentation, which would have some titles that might be useful afterwards. In terms of decision making and decision makers, I'd like to look first at climate-sensitive infrastructure decision-making, talk about infrastructure decision-makers, and then talk a little bit about a climate change infrastructure vulnerability evaluation process that was developed in Canada recently, and some case studies that were done associated with that. There's lots of infrastructure decision-making that happens, and many people in this room are associated with that in one form or another. However, some of that infrastructure decision-making is more climate-sensitive than others. We see that in some of the climate and weather numbers that get used in some of the decision-making. And perhaps a good indication for where climate change adaptation is most useful would be to look first at those areas where climate and weather information is already being used. In making some climate-based infrastructure decision-making, I'll suggest to you that there are sort of four components to the broad stretch of making that decision-making. One is related to the administration, be it public sector or private sector. The idea that there has to be, in a sense, direction from the top of the food chain in terms of, yes, we want to take climate change adaptation into account and back that up not only with a clear mandate, but also resources for people elsewhere in the organizations to take that into account. Two, there's an applied policy portion of the decision making. This takes into account the actual execution and the accountability for the activities associated with that. Part three is perhaps not so well called basic science, but essentially there's a level of information with respect to the existing potential climate changes that could be happening, as well as perhaps a fair amount of baseline information that may or may not be known or available or at the table at the time that one is looking at doing that information. For example, if one were thinking of what is the effect of climate change on the watershed, and you don't really have a good grasp on what the water budget is to begin with, then it's kind of tricky to make recommendations on what climate change might be doing to it if you're not sure where your starting point is and what the incremental changes might be associated with that. The fourth part we'll talk a little bit about is the applied science portion. And these are sort of the tools and applications that are used to go from your baseline information, take into account climate change in the decision making, and then come out at the other end with some recommendations or conclusions. In terms of who are the decision makers, I'll suggest to you that it's really a team that's involved, in the same sense that it's a team involved in a lot of infrastructure decision making. And maybe it's a team, or maybe it could also be considered a network of decision makers. In the literature associated with this particular event, it mentioned developers, managers, and practitioners. I'll suggest to you that perhaps that network is a little wider than that in the big picture. In terms of an administrative portion of the decision making, that would include the owners and operators. If it's the case of Vancouver or Delta, some of the people we've talked about today, that would involve direction at the level of council or chief administrative officer with some of the resources to go with it. It may also be that if new infrastructure is being done and part of it's being done through the private sector, that those people providing the finance may also be involved in providing direction for climate change to be taken into account. Bringing it a little more closer to home in a related but different circumstance, often now people's homes are being bought and sold. One of the items that is done as part of due diligence is an environmental checklist of issues related to a house. At least on the East Coast, that's not something that any government has mandated to be done, but it is something that over the last 15 years, financial institutions those providing the mortgage money or loan money have called for that to be part of the process. The applied policy part of decision makers are the managers and operators of infrastructure. The basic science portion is the climate information. We have some representatives here today from both Environment Canada and Kronos, but also resource management people and researchers, university people, those sorts of things. And then on the applied science side, this is likely where you're going to encounter planners, engineers, and other practitioners that may be involved in that network of people involved in the decision making. For the owner-operator financiers, there may be a variety of goals that they want to take into account. Some of them may not even realize it yet, but this may be percolating away in the back of the mind. One is to be able to incorporate climate change adaptation into the development, design, and management decision making. Another is to have a rational method used to assess climate change infrastructure vulnerability and make conclusions and recommendations. Another, something should be done in a way that is flexible and that it can or has been used with variable locations and circumstances in the real world. Eric Sparling's here from CSA and he'll speak later on today, but ideally if there's a platform of decision making that's can be useful in a variety of locations and a variety of circumstances, that can be useful for the society or country as a whole. 4, be able to incorporate climate change adaptation into current best practices, standards, guidelines, and procedures. If the decision making involving infrastructure already is making use of things such as the Canada Building Code or provincial flood management policy or that sort of thing, then trying to be able to incorporate climate change adaptation into those existing policies and procedures. That way it's not reinventing the wheel, it's more or less adding an extra layer or element or modification to some of the decision making that's happening. Have a rational method to prioritize various potential adaptation options. It may be that in looking at a particular circumstance and in doing work with the community and outreach, that there may be 4 different options that come back to the table of, yes, this might be an appropriate way to go forward. Well,